But okay, so hello everybody. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Jenna Henry. I wear many hats in the political landscape of Pennsylvania. Today, I'm here as the secretary of the board of the Keystone Progress Education Fund. Happy to be here with some of my favorite people in PA politics, Representative Emily Kincaid and Deborah Hinchy, who is the executive director of Better PA. And we're going to talk today about the way that the Republicans in Pennsylvania are weaponizing constitutional amendments. We saw them do this with, the perfect example and was the governor's emergency powers, right? Whenever they were so mad about the pandemic that they put out a constitutional amendment to get around his powers. And then when they were successful, basically decided this was the new thing that they were going to start doing. So I think, Emily, I'm going to kick it to you first, because as a state representative, you really have a front row seat to this shenanigans. And I think, why don't you just kind of give us a breakdown of exactly what they're doing and, how they're trying to skirt the governor.
Sure. So just to give you guys an overview, in Pennsylvania, the way that we can amend our Constitution is passing legislation through both houses, both chambers, and it has to be exactly the same. We have to pass it twice, so through two different sessions. So you pass it, let's say you pass it in the 2019-2020 session, then you have to pass it again with no amendments, no changes, not even a different comma. So you can't even make technical changes, and you pass it again. So the 2021-2022 cycle. So it is ostensibly, or should be, relatively difficult to amend the Pennsylvania Constitution, because there's different people in each session. There's changing priorities. There's different things. And actually, when I was doing advocacy around campaign finance reform and really pushing for public financing of elections, particularly for our judicial elections in Pennsylvania, I was told, basically to do that, you have to have a state constitutional amendment, and it's nearly impossible to get a state constitutional amendment. So that was in 2007, basically, when I was in college. So you fast forward to now, and there have been over 75 state constitutional amendments introduced in this session alone. Now they will, if they're moved, they have to pass through through next session as well. But we're seeing the Republican Party really come into lockstep with, actually running some of these bills. And so, we're seeing, I think here's one, for example, of just like the kind of the Christmas tree of amendments that they're kind of trying to jam through. Is there was a bill that was introduced in the Senate, which would amend the Constitution to make the lieutenant governor's position would no longer be an elected position. It would be just like we do at the federal level, where the gubernatorial candidates would choose a running mate. So it's actually pretty non-controversial overall, and would have had pretty good bipartisan support, except that the House then amended that to include things like voter suppression, voter ID laws, requiring voter ID, making the Secretary of State an elected position in Pennsylvania, further limiting the governor's executive powers. It's just like a whole Christmas tree of constitutional changes attached to this, lieutenant governor no longer being an elected position, bill. So, so we're seeing a lot of that kind of stuff. And I'll get into more detail about, what exactly is being proposed and what has been proposed, what's come up. And actually, next week I'm on the Judiciary Committee. We have yet another state constitutional amendment that we're considering in committee. So I'll talk to you about that. But I just wanted to kind of give you guys an overview of, what is the process for state constitutional amendments, and now, why we're all of a sudden seeing, tons of constitutional amendments where we used to see maybe 10 in a session. Now we're seeing, we're probably going to crack 100 constitutional amendment proposals before the end of this term.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy to think about, right? Like 74 amendments to the Constitution. Yeah. Okay. So, Deb, do you want to talk a little bit about, like from your perspective as an organizer, like why, I know you're building a campaign plan around, kind of stopping, against this whole idea of legislating by constitutional amendment. So like as an organizer, just kind of talk a little bit about why do you feel that that's like the biggest threat to our democracy right now? Like that, like why the urgent need to stop this?
Sure. Hi, y'all. My name is Deborah Rose. Like Jenna said, I'm the director of Better PA. Why constitutional amendments are one of the greatest threats to our democracy. I feel like when we rank them in this moment here, 2022, when we rank the threats to our democracy, it's kind of hard to pick a top three. I do think the threat of governing by constitutional amendment is up there. I think that I think Rep. Kincaid gave a really succinct outline of what the process is and why it's so dangerous. I think it becomes equally more dangerous when you find out what's inside these 75 constitutional amendments, because they're terrifying and they range from ending environmental regulation to basically saying there's no right to an abortion in the state of Pennsylvania. But even scarier are like the 35 that focus on democracy and the erosion of democracy and the erosion of voting rights in the state of Pennsylvania. And why I think it's probably the largest threat to democracy is because what I've seen over the last year and a half after 2020 is the Republicans scrambling to figure out new and interesting ways to circumnavigate and circumvent democracy. And this, after the 2021 constitutional amendments about executive orders, this seems to be like their prime approach, because one of the things I think gets left out of the conversation is why the Republicans are doing this. And it's because it circumnavigates the governor's veto pen, right? Like, this is the way they can create law by working around the one stopgap that still exists in Pennsylvania government. And so they have figured out, and I think that one of the things that I think is very interesting about this issue is how much the Republican Party is banking on like the showing of the 2021 executive order votes, when in actuality those votes were incredibly close, and really they benefited from a lack of effort. And that this is not a shade, or this is not a judgment. This is just burnout from 2020 that I think we can all recognize was very, very real, but a lack of ability and capacity on our side to push back on these amendments in November of 2021. And they were able to eke out 2 wins. And now they're building an entire strategy to circumnavigate democracy around 2 wins that they eked out in November of 2021, like 9 months after every organizer in Pennsylvania was just like completely burnt out from the 2020 cycle. So all of that builds on itself to say that like a really great campaign strategy that pushes back on these amendments, that like takes an inside outside strategy, where the Democratic Party is on the inside and organizers are on the outside pushing, could really beat this back as a tactic if it doesn't look like a viable tactic to the Republican Party anymore. If we actually pull all of our organizing energy and push, there's a possibility that we're not pushing for the next 5 years, that we're only pushing for the next year or two, because they won very smallly in 2021 and now they're putting all their eggs in this basket. So from my end, a show of force in this moment where we're like still slightly ahead of the 8 ball because we notice what they're trying to do, and for once we're not playing catch up. They haven't successfully gotten anything on the ballot. Like, if we beat some back, they will stop seeing it as a viable tactic. So that was the long and short of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's everything that they try and do is astounding, right? Sometimes, but this one just like really takes the cake for me, because these are people who claim to like have such pride in our founding fathers and all of this, and it's kind of like, okay, then you're shredding the Constitution, it's now the opposite of these things that you claim to respect them for, and it's just always incredible. But I think you said something really important, and that's about beating these things back. And so I'll go to Emily first to talk a little bit about what is the Democratic Caucus? I mean, we've heard kind of some whisperings of some things that were being done to push things back. What are you seeing happen on your end to push back against some of this?
Sure. So I want to take a little bit of a step back and actually talk about, so what are some of these constitutional amendments specifically that have been proposed? The very first thing that I voted on in any capacity was in the Judiciary Committee. It was like first meeting out of the gate, being an elected representative in 2021. And it was a constitutional amendment that would allow for statewide judicial districts. So obviously right now for our appellate courts, we elect our judges statewide. And in 2020, the state, the Supreme Court slapped the Republicans down repeatedly around mail-in ballots. And so Russ Diamond had this bill just hanging out because he thinks that we need geographic diversity on the Supreme Court. Now, geographic diversity is not a protected class. Like your geographic location is not a protected class. We don't even have protections for people who actually have immutable traits like LGBTQIA plus individuals in Pennsylvania, but we have to protect people's geography. So he's been drum banging on this for a long time, and it basically had its moment then in 2019, 2020 in that session, because the Republicans saw an opportunity to punish the Supreme Court for actually exercising its independence and its check on the legislature. So then first thing that we did in the 2021-2022 session was to vote for the second time on this amendment. So this amendment would basically, there's no requirement in this amendment that judicial districts be equal in population. You could have a district that would contain Allegheny County and a district that would contain Philadelphia. And then all the other districts for the court would be you could have 3 districts in Tioga County. There's no requirements that they be of equal population. And there is no outline for how this would be put into place. So if this were to get passed, then approved by the voters, then we could potentially see all of our statewide courts dissolved overnight. So we have no more statewide judges, no more statewide appellate courts until they can run for reelection. And the other thing is that, I'm a lawyer by training, and I just have to tell you that the law does not mean different things in different places. The law is supposed to be interpreted exactly the same in Allegheny County and Philadelphia and York and Tioga County and Juniata County. It is the exact same. It means the exact same for everybody. So the idea that we need districts for geographic diversity on our courts is absolutely absurd, because it implies that the law should be interpreted differently in certain areas of our state than it is in other areas. Now, fundamentally, what this does is allow the Republicans to draw judicial districts, gerrymandered judicial districts, so that they would have a permanent majority on all of our appellate courts. Because right now, the Democrats have the majority on the Supreme Court, and they don't like it. So, we are seeing these constitutional amendments be weaponized to punish any other branch of government that would have the audacity to check a Republican majority legislature. So that's not the only attack on our judiciary that we have seen. We have passed out of the Judiciary Committee an amendment that would put term limits on our appellate on judges. We have seen a constitutional amendment pass out of it that would require judges to run for partisan reelection. So this is right now we do you don't have to run a whole new race. So now you've got judges that potentially are going to be actively hearing cases while also having to fundraise from potentially the same people who have cases in front of them. It's a huge conflict of interest. It's incredibly problematic. And, so they're doing that. We have a constitutional amendment that we passed out of Judiciary Committee last week that would allow the legislature oversight over court rules. And these aren't just like, oh, this is how you run your court. This is like the rules of civil procedure, the rules of evidence, the rules of appellate procedure, the rules of criminal procedure, that somehow the legislature would have the right and the authority to basically veto any court rule that they don't like. And it's incredibly dangerous to our whole judicial system and the way that it works. It becomes incredibly politicized. And then we're contemplating yet another constitutional amendment next week in the Judiciary Committee that would also attack the judiciary and its ability to operate independently. Now, those are just the amendments that attack our judiciary. Those are just those ones. There have been a bunch that have come out of state government that have to do with voting rights and voting access that attack sort of our fundamental tenets of democracy. As Deborah said, there's amendments that would ban abortion in Pennsylvania in sort of relying on the idea that we're going to see Roe v. Wade overturned, and that they're ready to go to make it all, illegal in Pennsylvania. And there are a ton of constitutional amendments that limit the powers of the governor. Now, I think that those are honestly the stupidest ones, because it's incredibly short-sighted. What they are doing is neutering the governor without any recognition for the fact that a Republican governor would be just as hamstrung. So if a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature went head-to-head, the Republican governor would have equally, as little power as they're trying to give a Democratic governor under a Republican majority. Now, one of the other amendments that they've proposed is an amendment that would abolish the Legislative Reapportionment Commission, because they were mad that fair maps were drawn this time around. And so rather than having a 5-person commission, which is, still comprised of members of the General Assembly, the leaders of the General Assembly, the Democratic leader and the Republican leader of the House and the Senate, and then a 5th party that either those 4 can agree upon, and it's never in the history of the commission happened, or a person that gets appointed by the state Supreme Court. Again, reasons that we want to attack the Supreme Court. But because that commission actually drew fair maps this year, and the Republicans did not get to gerrymander the shit out of these maps, we are now seeing an attack on the redistricting commission. And now what the Republicans are proposing is that we, the state legislatures, we just draw our own maps, and just like we do with Congress. And that's going to go really well, because you're going to see a lot of like horse trading of people, and we are playing chess with real people pawns, and it is horrifying to see. So I say all this because this is all of the stuff that we are dealing with, and fundamentally, like, what are we doing within the Democratic caucus to kind of push back on it? One of the big things is we are getting out there and having conversations like this to educate people about just how dangerous this is and how ridiculous this is, because we're trying to basically, in a democracy, neuter democracy, because it turns out that fair elections and democracy are not convenient for the Republican Party at this point. And so they are just like, well, what if we just say it's a democracy, but otherwise it's not? And so we're trying really hard to get the message out and get people fired up, because in the history of Pennsylvania, I think there has been only one ballot referendum that's actually been turned down, that the voters have not approved, because very often they are not informed about these things, and it's hard to inform them about these things. So educating voters that, like, Republicans are relying on voter disinformation and voter suppression tactics to keep people who would vote these things down from knowing what they're voting on. I think a great example of this is Marcy's Law. If you guys have any idea about that, Marcy's Law is it was a bill in a lot of different states that it passed in, and then it's been struck down as unconstitutional by those state Supreme Courts. So now the people who are pushing Marcy's Law are trying to get state constitutional amendments passed. So in Pennsylvania, we actually passed the constitutional amendment, but what this would do is basically give legal standing to to victims of crime, on par with the defendants. So if you can't get a victim to come in, if you can't get in touch with them, if you can't give them notice, then a criminal proceeding cannot go forward. And so it brings our judicial system to a screeching, grinding halt. And that is what has happened in every state that Marcy's Law has been enacted in. And most of those states where it hasn't been struck down, it's been repealed because it's just such a bad system. Because fundamentally, we're all sympathetic to victims of crime, and nobody wants to see anybody be a victim of crime. But when you give crime victims the same standing as defendants, the same kinds of rights, then, it is, criminal or victims of crime don't have the same stuff at stake. Their liberty is not at stake against the government. And that's fundamentally why we have the Bill of Rights, is to protect people from losing their fundamental rights to the government. Crime victims are not subject to that. They don't have that same vulnerability. And that's why we don't have those already. But, it sounds really nice when it's on a ballot. Like, do you want to, give victims of crime the ability to, more, like, have more say in holding their the perpetrator accountable? Yeah, who doesn't? Absolutely. Yes, I'm a vote, but yes. And then, it passes, And it turns out that it's an incredibly bad thing for actual, due process and defendants' rights. And, these are the kinds of things that we're pushing through. But, you put it on a ballot and you make it sound nice, and voters by and large are like, yeah, it seems like I'm doing a good thing. I'm going to vote yes on this. And it ends up being really bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so much, right? Like it is so much. I mean, I almost forgot about Marcy's law because of all this other constitutional amendment stuff. I mean, when they tried to abolish the LRC because they were having a temper tantrum, that one was just insane. But yeah, I think that with Marcy's law, you bring up a really good point, because but I like the average, what we're trying to figure out, and I know what me and Deb have spent the last few months trying to figure out, is like, how do we explain to people that this isn't the shiny thing wrapped up in a bow, that this question makes it sound like it is? And like, how do we actually explain to people that this is such a dangerous thing? And that's kind of the $1 million question in Pennsylvania right now, is like, how do we actually talk to people about this thing, right?
Yeah.
Well,
and I will clarify, Marcy's law, while the referendum passed, was ultimately struck down by the courts, because you're only allowed to have a single subject in those referendums, and Marcy's law is another Christmas tree of changes. And so the courts were like, this is an invalid question. And so again, it's our courts holding our legislature accountable, and they don't like it.
Can I bop in there, because we're talking about the courts? I think the rep hit on something super important, and to talk about how this threat of constitutional amendments can influence what actually happens in the legislature. Because as we talk about the courts, I think it's probably important to talk about what happened in the redistricting process and how that all relates to HB 38, which is judicial gerrymandering, the bill that the rep was talking about earlier. I think that, check me if I'm wrong, Rep, but I feel like what I saw through the whole redistricting process was the Republicans holding HB 38 over the court's head to try to force maps that they wanted. And we were really, really lucky that we have a state Supreme Court made up of people from Pennsylvania who were basically like, nah, you can't threaten us. But what we saw through the whole process was think pieces, legislators, like political consultants, lobbyists, everybody saying that if the Supreme Court rules on a map that the Republicans don't like, we're going to see HB 38 on the ballot in November, which I don't think, even if they had gotten maps they liked, which they didn't, I don't think that would have prevented us from seeing HB. Whether we see it or not was kind of irrelevant to the maps themselves. But it is this another way that they're weaponizing these amendments, which is to try to influence the legislative process as it proceeds through the session. Rather, it's not just like, what can they change? It's what can they prevent from happening by using these amendments as leverage. And I would like to give a shout out to Jenna Henry, who, when the first draft of the map came out, she said offhandedly, they're going to try to abolish the LRC. And I was like, no, they would never. And like 3 weeks later, I texted Jenna. I was like, they're trying to abolish the LRC. And she was like, yeah, I told you.
Everybody was like, nah. I was like, I don't know.
You didn't say it to me. I would have believed you. Because that's
I was like, I literally said that's a bridge too far, and now I'm here.
There's no such thing as a bridge too far at this point, and that's sort of fundamentally it. Is that every time the we've weaponized constitutional amendments to the point where every single time that the Republicans run into something about our government that they don't like, that's inconvenient to them, they will introduce a constitutional amendment to abolish whatever that is, or change it in a way to make it easier for them to do whatever nefarious thing that they want to do. And I will also highlight, because it was a thing that I sort of struck me that I didn't even think about previously, is that right now we do have a democratically controlled Supreme Court, because we won in 2015. We swept all of the statewide judicial races. We have not, as Democrats, won another Supreme Court seat since then. We have won when there are 2 seats open in on the Commonwealth Court. We've split it. We've got a Republican and a Democrat. The Commonwealth Court controls a lot of our election stuff. That's where a lot of that goes, and it is a Republican majority. Patty McCullough, who is a judge on the Commonwealth Court, is the only judge in America who gave Donald Trump a win when it came to trying to overturn the 2020 election. She is the only judge in America to have done that, regardless of Democrat, Republican, all of them. She's the only one. So, that's an incredibly important court. It's controlled by Republicans right now. The Superior Court, which does criminal appeals and civil appeals and family law appeals, also controlled by Republicans. By and large, we're not winning a lot of seats on there. So this is where, these odd year elections, because there's no such thing as an off year election. It's an odd year election, are so critical for people who care about democracy to be showing up and voting in. Because these constitutional amendments that neutered our ability to respond to emergencies and like the pandemic passed in a low information, low voter turnout primary election. They went through in May of 2021. Most people didn't even know they were on the ballot. Allegheny County, which is where I'm at, had a high water mark of turnout at 31%. Philadelphia basically didn't show up. This is how they got it through, is because we're not showing up every election, every time. And they're smart, they're crafty, that they're passing these and getting them onto ballots that they know Democratic voters traditionally don't show up for.
I want to flag that in 2023, that could arguably bite them, but I think they will probably circumnavigate around it, because the primary of 2023 will see city council races and mayoral races in Philadelphia and a heated DA's race in Pittsburgh. And we probably will see urban turnout way up in this odd year election. But at that point, they will just circumnavigate and they'll put them on the general ballot rather than put them on the primary ballot. So yeah, we can't count on just making sure they land on the right ballot. We just have to be able to, we have to treat them with the urgency that they deserve. But at the same time, I feel like there's 2 big questions that Jenna and I and like a bunch of people who are like terrified of constitutional amendments have been batting around, which is like, what does voter education and political education look like when it comes to constitutional amendment, governing by constitutional amendment as the issue? And how do we attack the larger, like, how do we attack constitutional amendment, governing by constitutional amendments as an issue, or do we go at them one by one? And like trying to figure out, like, so much of building a strategy to beat them back is trying to figure out if we're attacking them individually, like, for those who may not know, HB 38, judicial gerrymandering, had an army of people beating it back on the outside, which does provide us a template for how to beat them back individually. But, or do we beat back the issue of governing by constitutional amendment? And if so, how do we do that? Like, those are my 2 big organizer questions, is like, which strategy do we take and how do we talk to people about it? Because the political education gap is terrifying.
Yeah. And I think the answer to it is both. Because Yeah, it was a weird, HB 38 is a really great example of strange bedfellows, because we saw the Chamber of Commerce, the trial lawyers, we saw labor unions, conservative and liberal labor unions uniting to basically say, this is a stupid amendment. You're going to destroy our court system. What are you doing? And if you do this, if you vote on this, we are pulling all of our support from your people. We're done. You're dead to us. And it was a real shot across the bow, that was taken seriously. And they did absolutely use HB 38 as a stick over the courts, as challenges were happening, as the maps were coming out. But and they also are periodically threaten impeachment of the Democratic justices. And so that's another aspect of it. I will say, of the 75 amendments that have been introduced, there is one that I want to bring and highlight that's actually really good. It's a state constitutional amendment that would require 2/3 majority of the House and the Senate in order to pass an amendment to the Constitution, because right now it's a simple majority. So it would give the minority power to block bad constitutional amendments from happening. And I don't know why it's a simple majority right now. It should be 2/3. It should always have been 2/3. Representative Pam Snyder and I believe Representative Ryan Bizzaro, introduced that bill, and I was like, 100%, I'm in. Let's do this. And so, unfortunately, it's a Democratic bill. It's a Democratic amendment, and it would, rob the Republicans of their fantasy land, where they get to, pretend to be in favor of democracy while attacking it. So it's not going to go anywhere. But it's also like, that's something that we could coalesce around. As if we want to stop these other bad amendments, I think we look at the template of HB 38 and the people who got on board with that and say, you were willing to block HB 38, and we need your help to make sure that we can do this, that we're being responsible in the way that we're amending things. State constitutional amendments have basically become Pennsylvania's filibuster. And I'm going to say something maybe controversial, but I don't think we should abolish the filibuster. And here's why. The filibuster fundamentally is not the problem. The problem is that we changed the rules around the filibuster, because when the filibuster first was put into place in the U.S. Senate, it was, you kept the floor as long as you held the floor. So you had to be on the floor and speaking, or they could proceed with a vote. Now we're allowing people to filibuster without actually taking the floor, which is really what's causing the Senate to come to a screeching, grinding halt. We need to change the rules around the filibuster, because I do think at times it is useful for, to really get a message across. But we should not be able to filibuster on procedural votes, of like votes to bring something to a vote. You shouldn't be able to filibuster on that. And you shouldn't be able to filibuster without being present on the floor speaking for the entire time. If you yield the floor, if you take a drink, if you want to eat something, if you need to go to the bathroom, if you want to take a break and sit down, you've yielded the floor. That's it. Filibuster's done. We should make people have to do that, put in the work in order to do that. I don't think we even need to abolish the filibuster before, we just need to reform the filibuster. And that's what we fundamentally have to do around state constitutional amendments in Pennsylvania is we have to reform the way that we do it in order to make people work harder to amend our Constitution, because there are things that should be amended, and we will discover more things that should be fixed, but we should not be governing through constitutional amendment.
I think that is a really excellent comparison for another reason, because like, oh no, I lost my train of thought.
Oh,
That's okay. I can filibuster some more.
Oh, I do want to drag us back to this, the thing that you said in the beginning, which is about one of the good constitutional amendments, because I think they're the 5 to 10 really great constitutional amendments that are buried in this list are actually the Republicans' own weapon too, right? Because they can pass one good constitutional amendment and prevent a vote no campaign from ever getting off the ground. So like my primary goal in organizing early on these constitutional amendments is the idea that that we can keep them off the ballot. Like that the best way to do this and the best way to save capacity for progressives is to keep them off the ballot so that we don't have to run very big, expensive vote no campaigns. But once they hit the ballot, the Republicans are very conscientious of making sure there's something on there we can't tell people to vote no on, so that we can't run a massive vote no campaign. And that happened in May of 2021, where we had to tell people vote no, 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 yes, no. And it became incredibly confusing for folks. So there's a couple in there that I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Oh, that one should definitely happen. And we know that if they pass a bunch for the 2023 cycle, that they're going to pass one. That means that we can't just be like, vote no on everything.
Yeah. Well, and here's the fun aspect of what actually we had to tell people to vote yes on it. And I was actually telling people to vote no on it because the candy coating, if you will, that they applied to this, these amendments was including in the state constitution protections against racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination that are already unlawful in Pennsylvania. What they strategically did not include were any forms of discrimination that are not protected against in Pennsylvania, including LGBTQIA plus protections. So I was telling people, I was like, vote no on all of them, because these things are all like the things that sound good are it's already law in Pennsylvania, and everything else is terrible. So just vote no straight down, because you're not harming anybody with these no votes. Now, the other aspect that gets confusing too is that then, cities and municipalities and whatnot will have their own referendum. So then you're like, no, 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 yes, yes. and that was also, difficult. But
Philadelphia almost always expands their general fund through through ballot issue. And we have to vote yes on that so that schools can get money. And that, like, Philadelphia organizers who are also I am located in West Philadelphia. Philadelphia organizers who also do statewide work have been having this conversation of how do we balance when it comes to the ballot. Like, we need people to vote yes on municipal ballot issues, and we need people to vote no on state constitutional amendments. And how do we create enough political education that makes sense to folks? They really boxed us into a corner.
Yeah, and I think that's really where a lot of organizing around the actual state legislators is helpful to keep things from getting to the ballot. And that's why you haven't seen HB 38 actually on the ballot. It's why you haven't seen a lot of these constitutional amendments that could potentially, there are some that we voted on that are on their second round this time around, and HB 38 is probably the most egregious of all of them. But there are things that have been proposed that haven't even come up in committee, because there is organizing in order to lobby legislators and really use a stick with them of like, look, we're not going to tolerate the fact that you are legislating through constitutional amendment. This is not a constitutional issue in Pennsylvania. This is a legislative issue. And if you can't get it past the governor, then you need to start actually writing bills that you can get past the governor. And it's not, you do not have the authority to circumvent the checks and balances of the other branches of government because they're inconvenient for you. They're supposed to be inconvenient. And, you know, so we are, I think, being relatively successful in organizing in that capacity. And I will also say that, you know, so Speaker Cutler is very much he wants to see judicial appointments. He doesn't want to see judicial elections. Like, that would be the reform for the judiciary that he'd like to see. And there's a lot of lawyers that they're on board with that. I'm a little iffy on it because I also think that elections are how we get more diverse people onto the bench, because you can self-nominate, and you don't have to, it's not about who you know at that point. But you know, it's sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But to the extent that Speaker Cutler is an attorney, he has a vision for how he would like to see the courts reformed, and also that he understands that these are not actual reforms. This is breaking our judiciary. You know, we have people that are in leadership in the Republican caucus that are actually disinclined from doing some of these things.
I think one of the things that 38's organizing hub, big shout out to the JIPA table, who has like really been holding it down for a year and a half, has provided us an opportunity to map those people too. Like, on the inside, other reps, they know who those people are. They know who the soft targets are. But if you're an organization that doesn't have lobbyists, that doesn't have that kind of access and that kind of resources, one of the great things that has happened through HB 38 is the opportunity to map who the lawyers are that are sympathetic to democracy and aren't going to go too far. Yes, they're Republicans, but they're also members of the bar, and they're not going to go too far, and the trial lawyers can move them. Or the Republicans who have been working with the trade unions for 25 years, and yes, they're Republicans, but they're not going to go too far because they're also labor guys. In their brains, they're labor guys. And like, it has provided us a really great opportunity for future constitutional amendments to map who those people are and how those people can be moved. And like, one of the other things I think has been great about the HB 38 fight is the trade unions and the trial lawyers really deciding, we're going to shake a big stick. We're going to throw a big stick, and being able to draw the comparison between HB 38 and whatever comes next for those two, like, very influential groups of people, that HB 38 is not the last time they're going to have to say, we'll pull funding. Like, we cannot abide. And I think they're much more well positioned than like a lot of the smaller orgs who see it as like an existential crisis to democracy. I think they're starting to wake up and see it as a bunch of them as existential crisis to democracy, especially a much more draconian version of voter ID. Like, because we already have voter ID in Pennsylvania. I think that's what gets confusing for folks too, is we already have voter ID. But like, this draconian form of voter ID that came out in the constitutional amendment that out of Seth Grove's circus committee is draconian. You have to mail a copy of your driver's license if you want to vote by mail. And I think that stuff can move the trial lawyers and the trades.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how things play out over the next couple of months. Because something that's interesting to me is that a lot of these Republicans are facing primary challengers. Whenever I was looking through the list of people who have filed petitions to run for office, I mean, Brian Cutler has a primary challenger. Mm-hmm. Some of these people who haven't necessarily been moderate are getting primary challengers from what we can only assume are even further right people. And I'm a little bit worried about how that's going to affect their behavior through primary season, because if they feel like they're in preservation mode from their own side, they're going to feel like they need to be crazier.
Yes. And what they're doing is they're moving bills like this anti-trans bill that's up for a vote on Monday. Now, the benefit is we only have 2 session weeks before the primary, and then we have a session week immediately after the primary. So there's only so much crazy they can be before the primary. And then we get to find out just how crazy they're going to be after that. But there is sort of a, we're going to be able to breathe easy after the last week in April because, they may not do as many crazy things as we think that they are. So there is actually a Marcy's Law sort of redux that's coming up in Judiciary Committee in next week for me. But yeah, so thankfully only 2 weeks. But Jenna, I'm sorry I interrupted your point.
Oh, no, that was all I was saying, is that I'm just concerned that they're going to get even crazier because, people who are in survival mode, that's when they're the most dangerous, and I just don't want to see them get any crazier. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left. Do we have any questions from the audience? I know we've kind of covered a whole lot of stuff here. It can be stuff that's kind of confusing sometimes. I didn't know if there were any questions from anybody. I'm not seeing any in the chat. All right. Not seeing any. I don't know, if you want to each kind of like give us a closeout here on, what's next, right? Like, what do we do? We know that these people are nuts and they could possibly get even crazier. What is the best thing to do that people can do right now to help combat this?
I mean, I think the simplest thing is you vote for not these people and you organize for not these people. There are a lot of people who are running in races against people who, will support these, even if they're the more reasonable Republicans, if you will. They're by and large going to vote in lockstep around these things. So, I mean, I think Todd Stevens is the perfect example. So each and every time that we have a state constitutional amendment come through the Judiciary Committee, even though he's considered a more reasonable Republican, every single time that we have one come up, the Democratic chair, Tim Briggs, will move to have a hearing on it because we should be talking about the impact of amending the Constitution. And Todd Stevens, even though in the last time where we were talking about this amendment to allow the legislature to have veto power over court rules, even though he was like, I don't really know, this sounds bad, like I need to know more information about this, he voted no on having a hearing on it. He voted no, or he voted yes on moving the amendment forward. And he's like, I think we should still talk about this, so I'm going to vote to move it forward. No, if you don't have all the information that you need about something, you should never be voting yes on it. What are you doing? That is irresponsible, and that's what a lot of these folks are doing. So we need people to get out and door knock and talk to voters and do the hard work of moving things, forward. We have, for the first time in generations, by and large, fair maps. And we can make gains to really try and hold the Republicans accountable in the legislature and make them play nice with others. We can, at the very least, cut into their majority, if not actually get a Democratic majority and introduce some sanity to this world. But it doesn't happen unless people are active. And you have to be voting not just in even year elections, but in odd year elections. And educating your friends and educating your family and getting people out and voting. That is the way that we make this stop. And, in the interim, I think Deb's probably, the better resource for what do we do outside of the legislature. So I will turn it over to you now.
I mean, I think you're correct. I think that for the first time in 20 years, we are afforded an opportunity to, if not flip a chamber, cut into the majority in the House in a very real way, and therefore make it possible for us to flip a chamber in the future. And taking the opportunity that we're going to be afforded this year, even if it's not a great year for Democrats, it will not be as bad in Pennsylvania, no matter what else happens, because of these new maps. And working towards November 2022 as a goal and just cutting into the majority is like our best tactic. For me, my priority is talking to constituents in the Todd Stevens districts, the Chris Quinn districts, the Bucks County districts that seem impossible for us to ever win, no matter how much money we dump up there. Like, talking to the constituents there and trying to force them to talk to their reps. Like, there are very few moments in politics where I think it is important to strategically talk to specific people, but when it comes to constitutional amendments and keeping them off the ballot, I think that there is districts of voters that we need to be talking to very, very specifically, because like, once it hits the ballot, we need to talk to everybody. But beforehand, we need to be educating the constituents and the voters in the swing districts to be pushing on their legislators, because a lot of what worked in 38 was not just the trial lawyers and the trade unions, but also the constituents and voters in those districts, just like making it impossible to get through the phone lines on specific days. And like, I think that if the idea of political education around constitutional amendments as an issue statewide feels really overwhelming, we can narrow that focus in the short term to talk to really specific people. And like, it does feel really overwhelming. I'm watching lots of myself and lots of other organizers get overwhelmed by the totality of the political education that needs to be done, but we can narrow that focus so easily, at least for the next couple of months, to the next 3 to 6 months, by talking in southeastern Pennsylvania, in the suburbs of Allegheny County and Dauphin County, and make our lives easier and save some capacity for the other work that we need to do, which is to flip these seats. Like, we can't just focus on this as an issue, because we're also trying to flip the seats of the people we're trying to move. Like, and that's always that hard dichotomy, is like, we're trying to move these moderate Republicans at the same time as we're trying to get them out of office. And like, it's all hard balance to wield.
I saw that Michelle Green asked a question, and so I'll answer just real quick. Yeah, pretty much Democrats are in lockstep about these things, because we are not in favor of stripping the governor of his powers. We're not in favor of undermining democracy. We're not in favor of attacking our judiciary. And, by and large, because these are the things that have protected the minority of, not seeing the crazy bills that get passed, that there's a veto pen. There's the judiciary that's overruling things is unconstitutional. And so we have been in lockstep in opposition to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's been this, I don't know that I've ever seen the Democratic caucus so united, actually, around something. Like, normally there's some peel offs and people would disagree, but yeah, everybody is firm in saving Pennsylvania democracy. Will Democrats commit to new procedural rules when they win?
I mean, I can't speak to that because I'm a freshman. Right? These, I would like to hope so. I think that there will certainly be some rule changes. I don't know what they will look like, because I'm not in those rooms. I'm not privy to those conversations. I think part of it is also like a lot of people being like, well, let's win. And then, but I do think there is an aspect of, if we're the ones that are proposing these rule changes to, give the minority a say, then I think we need to practice what we're preaching. Like, it can't just be moves that we're making because we're the minority and we want to be able to have more say in things. We also need to, if we're in the majority, be giving that say and practicing what we preach. And maybe what that does is actually gives, the Republicans at a point where they get back into power, a little bit of a lesson on, actual bipartisanship, actual governing, and, that they don't change the rules immediately back to, tyranny of the majority.
Absolutely. Well, all right. This has been awesome. Really great talking with you both. Great conversation. Very excited to continue to work with both of you in whatever capacity. And yeah, this has been great. We are out of time for this session, but I believe there is still one more session going on for the folks who are still watching. I believe the last session is over at 6:30. So if you want to catch the rest of that, but yeah, so great to see you both, and look forward to talking with you again soon.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenna.